Hello and welcome. I'm Giorgio Rutelli, editor-in-chief of Formiche.net, and my guest today is Dr. James Carafano of the Heritage Foundation. James, thank you for being with us.
Grazie mille.
Thank you for being here. James is in Rome because he's meeting with politicians and think tanks, and he had a big event yesterday with Fondazione Fare Futuro, with Minister Adolfo Urso. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the hot topics that are really interesting for Italian audience and for the audience of Formiche. And we'll also try to, go against a little bit usual preconceptions that we have about American politics and the issues about the Ukrainian war, the war in Ukraine. The issues about China, the presidential elections that are coming up next year. So I will start with one idea that Italians and Europeans have when they hear about conservative politics in the United States, which is that conservatives tend to be isolationists. So they say that they don't want to, meddle with other countries' affairs. They'd rather talk about and deal about American problems and the problems of the American people. What you said once was really interesting, is that is true that conservative policymakers want to deal more with the interests of the American people, but when the interests of the American people it collides with something that happens elsewhere, abroad, right, then the American the United States has to intervene, and in the case of the Ukrainian war, what do you think that will happen maybe after the election? Do you think that the Republicans may drop the support for Ukraine, or do you think that actually the interest of the United States and the American people is to continue supporting Ukraine, and maybe even in a stronger way than today?
Yeah, so somebody that was in the military for 25 years and 20 years in think tank business and observing American politics, you can definitely say, look, there are isolationists in the Republican Party. There always have been. And they're internationalists. These are largely worldviews, right? So they're not really predicated on the time and circumstances that you're living in. They're just, we think this is the way you should do things. And the reality is there are also people like that in the Democratic Party. In neither case do they represent the real body of the party. Where I think Republicans and Democrats different, because the modern Republican Party, let's be honest, it's a conservative party. Right? Where most American conservatives are today is not really in an ideological space. And I actually think this is something Italians would totally understand. It's like because the bread and butter issues are so visceral to them. It's immigration, border security. It's the economy. It's my job. It's energy prices. It's crime, it's parental rights, it's how my schools are run, it's how my children are treated, it's my healthcare. These are the real bread and butter issues. So if you go to most conservatives and say, are you an isolationist or are you an internationalist? They'll say, what does this have to do with me, right? And this actually dovetails with, I think, the core of conservative foreign policy, which is really based on interests. So your foreign policy should reflect the interests of your people. It doesn't mean you don't do nice things. It doesn't mean you don't believe in human rights. But it believes that fundamentally, when you do things in the world, they should benefit your people, and there should be a cost-benefit analysis there that you're getting good and value for what you're putting into it. So in the Ukraine, and we should be clear on this, there's almost nobody in the American political space on the right or the left that wants the Russians to win. There's nobody that thinks the Russians are the good guys here. Everybody agrees Ukraine is the victim. People have different ideas about how much to support and what to do in Ukraine. And we also ought to be clear, and this is from both Republicans and Democrats, there would not be a Ukraine today if it wasn't for the United States, right? And I'm not taking anything away from Ukraine, because if Ukraine hadn't stood and fought, the country would have been overrun. But the reality is even though many European countries stood up and immediately supported Ukraine, if there hadn't been that mass of American military aid that came in so robustly, so early on, Ukraine would not have been able to fight and survive. So, and that was all America was really on that. I think where we are now is when you hear about more Americans asking, what are we doing in Ukraine and what's the way forward? It's not really about, well, we shouldn't be there. It really is a question about, are we doing the right thing? And much of that has to do not just with what aid are we providing Ukraine and for how long and what does that look like, but it's also about, well, we have other priorities in the United States as well. You know, and this again, something I think Italians would understand. We have record national debt. We have debt that's equal to GDP. We can't just...
You lucky guys.
Yeah, well, you know, we can't say that it's a blank check and we're going to spend forever. And in particular, and again, I'm not a Republican or a Democrat, I'm not political, but if you look at the way the president has supported Ukraine, he really has taken advantage of national support for Ukraine. So for example, if you say, well, we have a Ukraine spending package, what does that look like? Well, there's this much Ukraine spending, and then there's this much other spending he wants, and that much other spending. So essentially, he is exploiting the goodwill of the Americans to layer on a whole bunch of spending that we really can't afford because of debt. And I think that is the root of American concerns about what this looks like going forward. That's a calculation based on interest, because if your purpose of your government is to help keep people free and safe and prosperous, you don't get credit for 2 out of 3. You have to do on all 3. So it does us no good to help Ukraine if in the process we're bankrupting the United States, whether it's for spending on Ukraine or spending on stupid COVID policies or stupid infrastructure policies or stupid green policies. So I really think that when you see these kind of very superficial labels, and I'll give you a perfect example. Donald Trump was famously an isolationist. Mm-hmm. Donald Trump was going to put out of NATO. Well, I worked with the presidential transition team. There was never a plan to pull out of NATO. In the 4 years that Trump was president, he never actually did anything to pull out of NATO. As a matter of fact, he actually said one time, NATO was great, I fixed it, it's perfect, right? And I actually worked with the team on the plan for the next 4 years, and there was no plan to pull out of NATO. So this is rhetoric that we throw around, but when you actually look at the reality of what they do, Trump was very strong in the Middle East. He killed Soleimani. He pushed back on people in Syria. He butted heads with the Chinese. He was anything. He was
the Abrams Accord.
Yeah, and in Afghanistan. I mean, Trump didn't want to run away from Afghanistan. He wanted to find a way to end the war, and he wanted to not waste money. Trump spent less in a year in Afghanistan than Obama spent in a week. So Trump wanted to make sure what we were doing was smart and sustainable. We took no American casualties, and he wanted to find a path out. He didn't just want to cut and run away. That's much more the act of an isolationist. So I think a lot of times we're heavy on the political rhetoric, and we're really light on actually and looking and seeing what people are doing. The one thing I would not worry about is if there's a Republican president, because if there's a Republican president in 2025, it'll be a conservative president. What they won't be is, they're not going to be an isolationist. They're not going to be a nationalist. They're actually going to be something very similar to what you have in your government. They're going to be a leader who says, what's in the best national interest of our people, and gives them the best value for money in the foreign policy, and that's what they're going to do.
Okay, so the Europeans that are afraid about a shift in American support for Ukraine, or in general, its relationship with Europe more in general, you think that they are rushing towards some conclusions that are not based on precedent?
Well, look, there's a lot of continuity in American foreign policy. Look, if you go from Bush to Obama to Trump to Biden, concerned about China, concerned about Russia, concerned about Iran, supported NATO. That's 4 very different presidents, 2 different political parties, very different backgrounds, incredibly different politics, but on the really fundamental core issues, even sometimes against our own instincts, there is strong continuity.
Well, in fact, I mean, a proof of what you're saying is also what we witnessed in the passage between Trump and Biden concerning China. So a lot of people in Europe were thinking that once Biden would, take the White House, American trade policy would go back to where it was before Trump. So the trade war that was going on with China would stop. We would go back to a globalist approach to in the economy and in relationship. Well, actually, those relationships have become even tenser, and the trade restrictions are stronger now. And actually, they were perfectly coherent with previous foreign policy and Trump's foreign policy towards China. And they became, stronger and harsher. So how is China also a factor in American commitment in Ukraine and, on the side of Europe?
Well, first of all, I think, Ukraine is part of the China problem, because who benefits most from Russia destabilizing Ukraine, destabilizing Western Europe, fracturing NATO, pushing the US out? And the answer is the Chinese. So in many ways, forget about Taiwan, Russia is China's stalking horse in Europe. Russia was going to deliver exactly the kind of Europe that China wanted: fragmented, divided, distracted, and weak, right? That is defeating the defeat of Russia in demolishing the Ukrainian state is a defeat for China, period. Because it really does limit, I think it really both exposed their willingness to support projects that were destabilizing to Europe, but also I think it was a real serious defeat of them. It was also, I think, a real demonstration of the military power, despite all our problems with ammunition and everything else, but what we've mustered and brought to the table collectively as a community, I think has got to be eye-opening for the Chinese. You hit on a point which I think is absolutely true, to your point about, oh my God, how will the world change if it was a Republican president? On China, the answer is not much, right? China is one of the few issues in a country that is very partisan, and very, if you say it's black, then I say it's white. China is, I think, an issue that's broadly recognized among conservatives and liberals as a serious threat. I mean, we've gone so far. If you go to our website, heritage.org, we have a major report. We call it a Cold War. We said this is a new Cold War. You mentioned Trump, and what's interesting about that is when Trump came into office, he did pick up that Americans were increasingly concerned about China, and he made that kind of a pillar of his campaign. But he really saw China as a trade issue. That if he could just get the balance of trade right, he would come in and he would beat up the Chinese and get a good trade deal, and then the China problem would be solved. And I think what Trump discovered by the end of his presidency, that China is a bigger problem than just trade, and just kind of the threat to how free markets operate. If there had been a second Trump term, he would have gotten much tougher on a broader range of things. And in some ways, it might have looked like some of the measures that the current administration has taken. Here, I think, is the bottom line where America's going under Republican or Democrat, which is we are not going to allow for strategic dependencies on China that enable China someday to pull a string and prevent us from defending our own interests. And that, I think, is really the message we're trying to share with friends and allies. It's not don't do any business with China, don't have any China tourists, don't have Chinese restaurants. It's you're foolish to have a strategic dependency on China that creates a vulnerability for your own national security. I think a good example of that, to be fair, I think is the transition in the Italian government, where they actually saw a strategic relationship with China as a benefit. And I think you've had a new government come in and say, no, it's not a benefit. It's actually delivered nothing for us. And the notion of creating a strategic relationship with China really means strategic dependency. And in the end, that's going to going to make us weaker. I think that's where we really need to focus on going.
Well, yeah, now you're mentioning the Italian government and the fact that Giorgio Meloni has basically decided to pull out from the Belt and Road Initiative. And do you think that other European countries are as receptive of this urgency of this message from the United States, or you still see, because the European Union has changed its paradigm towards China quite noticeably since the beginning of this commission. The beginning of this commission, they were about to sign a trade deal with a comprehensive agreement with China on trade, and that was frozen at the last second, but it was about to be enacted. And so I think that, generally speaking, the European Union as an institution has changed its stance towards China. But what China does best is to divide and conquer, is to try to divide and conquer. So we have seen Xi Jinping since the end of COVID, since he started traveling again, meeting again with leaders, trying to pick them up and separate them and trying to offer, sweeter deals to each, European leader. What is your perception from the United States of this?
I think this is a very perceptive observation, and this is really my big warning to Europeans and to other countries and other places as well, which is the big marquee projects in Europe are dead. The big marquee Chinese projects. So Belt and Road, really, it's dead. What started as a 17+1, and now it's drifting down to the plus nothing, right? It's really dead, right? And so now what the Chinese have faced is because the Chinese don't want to give up on dominating in Europe. It's not just significant in terms of a competition with the United States in order to gain a more advantageous position against the United States. It's often greatly beneficial for China to dominate Chinese markets and indeed, European markets and indeed European space. Having lost kind of the glamour of the big projects and everything, the Chinese are going to be looking for the states and the countries where they have influence and access, and they're going to squeeze them to get to their end. That's going to put countries that maintain strategic relationships with China in a much more difficult situation. We're going to see the same thing from the Russians. I know there are people who say, well, let's keep relationships with the Russians because, we all live in the same neighborhood and we have to work this together. But you have a Russia which is getting humiliated and which is not going to bed at night thinking about, learned a lesson there. They go to bed at night thinking, how can I recover? How can I get back? How can I put the project back on road? And they're going to look for the gaps in the spaces and the inroads and the partners that they have, and they're going to squeeze them to get what they want. And it's just going to put them in very uncomfortable situations. I don't know the number, maybe you do it, but what did it cost Europe to get off dependence on Russian gas? This is probably, for all the money that people thought they were making off of cheap Russian gas, getting off of that was probably like $700, $800 billion. That was a big price tag. So people think that maintaining a relationship, with the Russians or the Chinese, that somehow it's going to give them a special place to negotiate things, or it's going to have a strategic advantage for them. I think it's a strategic vulnerability. I'm not saying we should give up hope that someday Russia becomes a normal country, or we should give up hope that someday the Chinese try to stop taking over the world. We should always pray for that. But we have to protect ourselves in case that day doesn't come anytime soon.
Yeah, what you said about thinking that keeping a strong relationship, both commercial and political, would be, the trick card to, avoid conflicts. Germany is a great example on how that did not work out.
The tragedy is it literally, the Russian strategic relationship was the cornerstone of German foreign policy. Yeah. It was an absolute disaster, not just for Germany, that it almost sacrificed 40+ million Ukrainians. It put all of Europe in peril. And the lesson that the Germans have learned for that is let's do the same thing with the Chinese.
Well, they had been doing it. I mean, Angela Merkel was the European leader that had most meetings with Xi Jinping in absolute terms.
Right.
So, of course, Germany probably is the country in Europe that had the strongest relationship with both Russia and China, and that benefited most from those relationships. But I think that things are changing now also there because, for instance, German entrepreneurs, German companies are realizing that China is not the market that it could have been for them, because they thought that they could import cheap stuff and then sell them luxury stuff. But now that EVs are the market, that we're talking about, EVs are the new thing. Yeah. They realize that Chinese do not want to buy German EVs; they want to buy Chinese EVs, and so I think that there's been a rude awakening also for the Germans.
Not only do they want to buy Chinese EVs, they want to get to the day when there is no German automotive industry, and the Germans are buying Chinese EVs, and they want to do that in the United States as well. I mean, we have seen this over and over again with the Chinese. When they move in a strategic sector, it is not just to make money and strengthen that sector. Eventually, they're going to bleed that sucker white, and then supplant it.
Yeah. So again, talking about Italian government and the relationship between Italy and the U.S. Yeah. So how it's going, how it's evolving, what is your judgment on this government, and how do you think that this government might work as a bridge, for the United States, also in terms of European policy, in terms of relationship with China, or in terms of, for instance, what this government should do in terms of Northern Africa commitment, a little bit your
I actually
panoramica on Italian policy.
First of all, I think this government, as we saw in the Meloni's visit to Washington, it was perceived as broadly bipartisan as a good thing, right? So Democrats and Republicans were both, I think, really optimistic and positive about the government and the bipartisan, which is a remarkable achievement considering both the nature of American politics and the fact that you have a conservative leader coming to Washington with a very liberal president doing extremely well, right? Just goes to show that. But maybe this isn't the answer you expected. I am really bullish on the bipartisan relationship because the Italians want to do a lot of things that are really good for the U.S. and where the U.S. actually needs to be prodded and pulled. And I'll give you 3 examples. One is North Africa. Look, we don't have a vital interest in North Africa, but we have to be concerned about that. Matter of fact, if you look at the immigration problem, the migration problem, it's not just a European problem. It's not just an Italy problem. We have thousands of African migrants showing up in Mexico every day and walking in the United States. So, and the transnational criminal links are getting strong as well. So, but, and for you guys, it's close to a vital interest. I mean, this is right at your doorstep. But the reality is we're never going to be able to really move the bubble in Africa just doing the stuff that we've always done, throwing foreign aid at it, doing counterterrorism drone strikes. If we're going to influence critical parts of Africa, we need to work together in a more collaborative way. And so Europeans and Americans, Middle East countries, South Korea, Japan, India, we need to be coordinating our efforts and bringing everything we can bring to bear to help partners that want to address problems, and also to counter the influence of the Chinese and Russians in Africa. This is a laser focus for Italy. So pulling people, the Americans, to pull other people together to focus on what we can do in North and West and East Africa, super important. The Med is super important. It is one of the superhighways of the world today. We want to keep the Med free and open. It needs to be not the forgotten flank of NATO. It needs to get every bit as much attention as we give to the eastern flank. And so the Italian voice is incredibly important. and that engagement with the U.S. talking about the importance of the Med is super. So I'll give you a simple example. We often talk about the Black Sea and the Russian presence in the Black Sea and all this. Well, the reality is, if there was ever real fighting in the Black Sea, we don't have to go into the Black Sea. I mean, forget about the Montreux. The U.S. Navy from the Mediterranean can sink anything in the Black Sea it wants to forever, right? We don't have to have a carrier in the Black Sea, but we damn sure have to be in the Eastern Med and be unchallenged there. And the third one is really the real opportunity to kind of knit Eurasian together in a way that really hasn't been really since the end of World War I. Linking the Indo-Pacific, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Indians, through a Middle East where the Arabs and Israelis are working together, connecting that to Europe is vital, because also it doesn't just connect them to Europe. Then that's the way they can connect through to Central Asia. India, for example, is never going to have a path to Central Asia through Afghanistan and Pakistan, and it's never going to have a northern corridor through Iran and Russia. If India and Japan and South Korea really want to, develop the central corridor, they're going to have to connect through the Black Sea and through the Med, and through the Middle East. Then you have, the Black Sea that connects to this real, I think, tremendous opportunity to build out the backbone of North, South Europe, Central Europe, which I think is enormous in economic potential, like 100 million people. It's a huge, huge market, a huge economic potential. Then you also have the potential to link all that energy and innovation and economic activity to help address problems on Northwest and East Africa. And of course, you also link across the Med to other European ports and across to the Atlantic to the US. Italy is in the epicenter of all this. And by supporting, I think, the Three Seas project, the build out of the Middle Corridor, the Indo-Pacific Middle East corridor, that is, I think that's a game, because what's happening here, and this is for the first time really since the end of World War II, all the post-Soviet space is kind of up for grabs. And it's not about building spheres of influence for Europe or the United States or for China or Russia, but Russia is greatly weakened. The China brand is down. Iran's relatively isolated. All these countries have an opportunity to do something, whether you're in the Caucasus or Central Asia or Central Europe or even Iran's. They have an opportunity to choose for themselves who they do business with, where they do business, how they do business. This is going to enable Eurasia to knit back together in a way that the traditional way it really did for centuries, really until the Soviet Union came along and blew it all up. So the U.S. should be supportive of that. We should be part of that. We should be engaged in that.
So we should go from the pivot to Asia to a pivot to Eurasia, maybe.
Well, the funny thing about the pivot to Asia, right, is what does that really mean? In military terms for the United States, it doesn't mean anything. 70% of the U.S. Navy
is already in the
Asia,
Pacific.
Right.
Yeah.
The other 30%, you can't have nothing anywhere else, right? 90% of the U.S. Army is in the United States, which is where it's going to stay, because that way you can send it wherever you need it. Our U.S. Air Force is based all over the world, but that's because we're unique in that we're the only Air Force that from anywhere in the world can deploy anywhere in the world. So it actually gets us closer to everything, and it makes us more survivable. So we're not going to move our whole Air Force to one place. That's just nuts. The Space Force is in space, right? So we need, I think, a much bigger conventional U.S. naval presence in the Pacific. I think that's our top priority. But we're only going to get that by building more Navy, right? So there is no military pivot. And when you talk about a geopolitical pivot, what do we see? I was at the Three Seas business conference a couple of weeks ago or whatever. There was a delegation in Bucharest, right? There was a delegation of 30 Japanese representatives there. So when you say we're going to pivot to Asia, where are the Asians? Well, the Koreans and the Japanese and the Taiwanese and the Indians, they're in Europe. Yeah. They're in Poland. They don't need to they're in Italy. So they recognize that it's not about all running under one lamppost. It's about connecting us together. And what you're doing is you're kind of robbing the oxygen of places for people to meddle. So it's not a Cold War in the sense of, well, there's a big sphere of influence and this is the red circle and we don't like anybody on their side. It really is about creating, in my mind, free and open spaces that are linked together, and you're just sucking the oxygen out of the room is that they have no place to go. And their choices are simple. You can either stay at home in your little sandbox and play with your friends, or you can be nice and play with other people and live in the free world. It's your choice.
Well, which I think it's always been, I think, the real issue on the table is that in the end, you only win this kind of competition, this kind of global competition, by setting an example and setting a way of life, setting some, a model that is desirable for other countries, and also connections that work for other countries. So in the end, you can be as autocratic or democratic as you want,
right.
but in the end, the final result is what you can actually deliver to your people and to.
See, I think that's the magic formula. It's like, if you're running a country and the goal of your country is to deliver for your people, then we have a neighborhood for you to live in, right?
Yeah.
And this is why, for example, you see the Indians, which they're one of the fastest growing economies in the world. They have to have growth. They need energy and growth. This is not optional, right? It's not that they're a democracy or whatever, but to do that, right? They need to connect with the West, and so they want to invest in this corridor. The Saudis want to make peace with the Israelis. They want the Middle East to be a place of peace and to do business. They want to link with that corridor. This is not American divisions. This is not American, finger waving. This is America just saying, you know what? People that want to help their people and do the right thing, and it's not really costing us. It's not foreign aid. It's just supporting,
facilitating a process.
People letting people live their own lives, and it is the opposite of imperialism. It is the opposite of colonialism, and it's the opposite of anything other than being just. And why would the United States care? Why do I care if India and Saudi Arabia and Israel want to build a rail network and then connect to Rome? Why do I care? And the answer is because it's good for me. It's good because I can connect with my friends. We can do business together. We can provide security together. We can link people together, and I benefit from that. So that's why I'm all in. And this is why this notion of America is going to be isolationist. This is nonsense. We gain nothing by sitting in our home. Now, do we gain anything by trying to change countries' regimes or build nations from scrap or bomb nations? I don't think we did. I would be the first to say that. But that's not what this is. This is about us looking after our interests, you looking after your interests, and there are places where it makes sense that we work together and support each other. That's how communities get built. That's how neighborhoods get built. That's how towns get built. This is a very, very different way of doing business. And and what really makes me optimistic about this is the way we did business for thousands of years. The places that we are walking through and connecting, this is how the world always connected. Now, sometimes they were invading armies, but it's also, that's how we did that's how we connected all to each other. That's how we moved knowledge. The other flip side to this is we have to connect free and open spaces, but we also have to stop mass migration. This is the most destructive thing in the world today. Every year, there is a forced mass migration in the world. Last year alone, there were 40 million displaced people in Africa. Population of Africa is probably going to reach 8 billion. We have places in the world where the population is really growing. The answer isn't move. And the answer isn't letting dictators push people and move them around, like forcing migration from Ukraine, for example. So that part of building free and open spaces is preventing people from exploiting them and doing bad things. So for example, what the Italians are trying to do is get control of this and not have migration be a destabilizing force for Africa and Europe. That's exactly the right thing.
Okay. Dr. James Carafano, thank you so much for being with us. It was a very nice conversation and very optimistic stance on connections and on links between the United States, Italy, and this whole new corridor that's being built in this time. So it's very interesting. We've been following it, and we will follow it very closely on Formiche. So again, thank you, and I hope to see you soon.
Yeah, ciao.
Thank you.